Mandy Carter.
Thank you so much, Stets.
Mandy.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
I have my Kleenex here because, well, first of all, Mandy Carter, 1948, in Durham, North Carolina, but born and raised in Albany, New York, upstate. I have my Kleenex with me because I am still stunned. The joy of what we saw yesterday, the timing could not be more fortuitous in terms of this conversation at this moment. So in my pre-call with Mav, I said, basically, I'm more than glad to kind of follow this conversation, but quite honestly, I think time to hear, to listen, the journeys, the seeds, and there are some practical things we need to think about. So if you will bear with me, I'm going to kind of go off script a little bit here because my emotions are very good, but they're so high. I'm still trying to figure out, I'm still settling into what we just saw and what had to happen before yesterday. The title is Where Do We March From Here? Post-Inaugural Regroup. Little bit of bio. I was born November 2nd, 1948 in Albany, New York. That's that post-World War II baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. Side note, after I was born and my brother Ronnie and Dolores, our mother got up and left and never came back. I was awarded the state of New York for my first 18 years. Life happens. But those first 18 years is a lot of people on this call in terms of the years of the dates of those baby boomers years. I will tell you, and why I ask this question once in a while, who planted the seed? Even though we were in the Albany Children's Home, the Schenectady's Children's Home, in fact, the Albany Children's Home is now Russell Sage Junior College. I could walk that campus like the back of my hand. But they put us through the public schools. I went to Mount Pleasant High School, graduated in 1966. Think of the years that's in terms of people on this call right now. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Does people remember the air raid bells going off, run home, duck and cover, the big symbol, those big symbols and, whatever. That was in November 1962. November 22nd, 1963, I know exactly where I was. Kennedy assassinated down in Dallas, Texas. And I remember thinking, you can't kill the president. It was just notion about what that meant and the trauma of that moment. But then 1963, 64, thinking about Freedom Summer, white folk going down to deep parts of Mississippi to figure out how can we get Black folk for the right to vote, Freedom Summer in 1964. And then some of the images coming up from the South, the hoses and the dogs and so on and so forth. 65, then we saw an even more, but the one that I would remember then, of course, would be April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. murdered down in Memphis. What was he doing? Helping garbage workers in terms of a union and a right to vote. Then, the last thing that King was working on, and this gets relevant to what we just saw yesterday, King was in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, because he wanted to figure out how could we have the conversation about a living wage, food to put on the table, a place to live. So he began this thing called the Poor People's Campaign, and it was meant to happen on the mall. And because of the murder that happened, a lot of people thought maybe we shouldn't continue on with the idea that we would go on with this action. There might be people on this call that might have been on that mall in 1968, but there was a decision to go ahead and have that campaign happen on the mall, Poor People's Campaign. It was called Resurrection City. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and we took 2 bus loads out from San Francisco, and we took buses across the entire country to get to the mall. One of the moments we had to stop in Louisville, Kentucky, because there had been threats on the buses as we were trying to get to Washington, D.C. And you know where they have the Kentucky Derby, the Louisville Downs? That's where we spent the night. This is 68, and I'm thinking, how is this possible? But there's a reality living in San Francisco, California, than what you got going across the country, going into the Midwest, going through the South. But we finally got to the Resurrection City. And then the next date on that calendar was September 68, when Bobby Kennedy was murdered in Los Angeles. KKK. Urban legend? Maybe, but think about it. Backdrop, and this is where the seed part gets in, and then I want to get into what happened on the inauguration. Because we went to the public high school system, when I was a junior in high school, my social studies teacher, Jack Hickey, brought someone in from an organization called the American Friends Service Committee. Had never heard of it. But the three things that that young student, young white guy, said to me is why I'm having this conversation with you all these years later. For people who aren't familiar with the American Friends Service Committee, it's the Quakers, basically full equality and justice for all, right? Then he talked about this notion of the power of one, that each and every single one of us has the potential to impact change if we so choose to act on it. And when he said that, it didn't quite ring with me, hold that thought. But it was the third thing he said. We have a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Who would like to go? I raised my hand. I got to go to that high school work camp in the Poconos Mountains. And it was the first time ever I heard the name Bayard Rustin. The first time I ever heard the name Audre Lorde. And the first time there was this young white folk singing couple from the Highlander Center, Guy and Candy Carowin. The Highlander Center is literally, if you live in the state of North Carolina, you go Asheville, you cross the border, they're like an hour from Asheville, like North Carolina. But they were saying that as white allies and as folk singers, they called themselves cultural workers. I said, what's a cultural worker? This is the time of Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Judy Collins, thinking about all the songs of the freedom movement and certainly the Vietnam War. But when they sat down and talked about what they were doing as an example of how you impact change, they said, you know what we're going to do? Even though we're white, even though we're folk singers, but the way we think we can be allies, we can take our tape recorder and we're going to go down into the South, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and record the freedom songs in those meetings that were happening in those Black churches. And they are now at the Smithsonian, if you want to listen to them. But one of the groups that was called the Freedom Singers, you know who was in the Freedom Singers? Bernice Johnson Reagan started Sweet Honey in the Rock. And by hearing the white couple as a Black woman, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, like they're willing to do this? They're willing to figure out how they could figure out a way to be an ally, but using the things that they have, song and culture and whatever. But because of that one high school work camp and planting the seed, it ended up being that if anyone's in the foster care system, some of you know this, you age out at the age of 18. And at the age of 18, I thought I might have a future being a doctor or something like that, but I flunked Spanish. And so I have to thank Jack Hickey, my social studies teacher and my Spanish teacher, because she flunked me. Initially, I was freaked out. What am I going to do? Where am I going to go? Because I remember thinking, Spanish, who's ever going to need this? Who knew? Thinking Spanish and how that ended up being in terms of the founding of Southerners on New Ground and the National Black Justice Coalition and the organizing in which we do, then ended up being really important because now with the demographics, and here's the key point I want to make, the demographics of this country are shifting dramatically. Right now, women are 51% of the population. By 2050, if not sooner, this country will be a majority people of color, keeping in mind who was already here indigenous to these lands. I was born in Albany, New York. Niskayuna, Ontiana, these are First Nations people. And here in the state of North Carolina, all 100 counties are majority people of color. I'm glad you're on this call, Kathy, because you know what's going on in terms of what's happening here in the state, but that might be relevant to other people on the call as well. So how does this get relevant now to what we just saw on the inauguration of Kamala Harris? I was thinking of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Shirley Chisholm, some of these women who would dare to think that it was possible when you didn't have the right to vote as women of color. But what did we have in common? Women couldn't have the right to vote. We came as property. And when you think of those who are women and of women of color, look how that connection is so right there. And what do we want to do with it? Thinking about how we move forward, thinking about that. And I want to give one example of sometimes how things come into conflict. If people remember, we didn't have the right to vote. There's a real tradition in the African community called jumping the broom. You know, we came here as property, right? And the founding fathers had to have property in order to be running for some, whatever they call whatever the sounding of the 13 colonies. Well, they had to own property. Some of their property were people. So at some point, the notion that someone would think that how do we even begin the conversation about how you go from being property, literally bought and sold, it's almost like someone said, this is not right. There's got to be some change. There has to be the beginning of the suffrage movement and the beginning of not, and also, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little backtracked here, but I remember thinking that when women didn't have the right to vote, they said, well, we're not going to have this. We're not just going to settle like that's nothing we can do. People said we need to figure out how we can organize around why we need to have it, how we're going to get it, and what we can do about it. So you had that whole track of women with the suffrage movement, and of course that meeting up in Seneca Falls. At the same time, you had allies and Black folk thinking should have the right to vote, and how they have their own individual kind of parallel track of how we had to secede in terms of how we had to get the right to vote and how we had to change that. And by the way, Black men got the right to vote before Black women did. Think about it. When you think about it, I'm not a historian, but I think about that. But I was pondering at this and thinking about when you had someone like a Fannie Lou Hamer or someone like a Shirley Chisholm, and when they know they didn't have it, they figured, how are we going to make sure that we have some way to get to the point of where the right to vote would be something we could embrace, a part of who we are, and that struggle. Thus why you had the Freedom Summer in 1964, when you had white students as allies going down to organize that. We didn't get the Voting Rights Act until 1965. 1965. You might see behind me, there's a poster that says, from Selma, 50 years later, after Selma, voting rights still matter. 1965, March, when John Lewis and other Black folks marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching to Montgomery for the right to vote. Johnson finally signed that bill, so we got it in 1965. And here's the amazing thing when you think about it. 50 years later, our first ever African-American president, Barack Obama, walked across that bridge with John Lewis, and thinking about how amazing that trajectory was, thinking about it. And here we sit in the year 2021, and yesterday, when Kamala Harris, who, by the way, I lived in San Francisco, District Attorney of the City and County of San Francisco, Attorney General of the State of California, U.S. Senator of the state of California, on to now Vice President. When she put her hand on that Bible, that was Thurgood Marshall's Bible. And there she stood, involved in an interracial marriage with her husband. But then she also had Sonia, am I saying the name right? Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina U.S. Supreme Court Justice, thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I'm full of emotions because I'm thinking, how did we get here? What was the journey? Are we understanding that? Who are the people that we have to really thank more importantly? I think someone's on here, 1938, born in 1938, those who came before. But now, our generation, and then you got the 18 to 35-year-olds. A fun fact for you, Kamala Harris was born in 1964. Baby boomers are 1946 to 64. If she was born in 64, what generation is she a part of? Irony? Maybe, I don't know. But interesting fact about what you want to do with that. I'm going to wrap this up a little bit with just a few more comments before I go. And I'm admitting I'm emotional. I don't mean to be all over the place, but I'm still sitting here pondering, and I had a box of Kleenex next to me because this is just so deeply profound. I mean, this is just so deeply profound. And I'll give my comments after we do the rooms that I want to listen into, but I was sitting here thinking about, how did we get here? I went to my first OLOC conference in 2006 here in Durham, intentionally wanting to have it in the South. I wasn't old enough and I joined, but I joined when I turned 60. But then I did it in 2009, and why those gatherings are really important. And we ended up being able to do sort of a pre-gathering of young people who weren't even, who were in their 30s or something. We did that just intentionally because they're going to eventually be 60 and older who might be a part of OLOC. But I was just thinking about that question, like how, where, when, who, um, and the power of one, thinking about how that makes a difference for me and then people going forward. So for me to be a part of this conversation also as a bridge builder, I'm a lesbian of color, you know, showing up in these conversations in the way we need to. But also I'm learning how to speak Spanish again because I'm realizing how critical that is for everyone. How ironic that is. I said, thank you, my Spanish teacher, because had she not flunked me, and here we sit. I'm going to end there. I'm done kind of rattling, but I just want to say thank you. I just OLOC, people who come into your lives, Edie Daly, Jackie Merkin. I'm looking at you, Rose Norman. I'm thinking of, you know, Chris Patty. I'm thinking of, you know, Barbara Smith. She came to one of their conferences, you know, Audre Lorde, just thinking about that and the moment in which we sit and just how much amazing, just extraordinary, extraordinary. So I will stop there. But I want to just say thank you, and I'm going to listen in on the conversations and come back around. And Lady Slipper Music, thank you. Thank you, Meg. Okay, stop.
Thank you, Mandy. That was really thought provoking. We still have many thoughts to go with where do we go from here. I'm going to turn this over to Deidre, who's going to be helping with breakout.
Okay, well, everybody, I'm going to.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate the patience with my, I didn't call it rambling when I was doing earlier. It was just a lot of emotion. But I got to visit several of the rooms and a couple of highlights. Besides Lady Slipper Music, Olivia, Goldenrod. I'm sitting here thinking wonderful about, you know, thinking about women's music and the festivals and how they had a profound impact. But also Ronnie, I'm thinking about Betty and the Warby Sisters League, another touch moment for me in terms of my journey and where I am now. I'm thinking about Alex, if you're on here, when we did the OLOC gathering in 2006, we wanted to give the award to Catherine Nicholson, who was co-founder of Sinister Wisdom. She almost didn't take it because she was so concerned about the assisted living facility she was living in. It broke my heart to think that that would be the situation. But Alex, you remember you performed when we got that too. And I'm trying to think in terms of where we are now. That should never, ever happen. But there's a great film called Jen Silent. There's some other films that are out there. Real quick, we have a lot of empty assisted facilities sitting here in the state of North Carolina. What if we got one and turned that into, and there's another facility in terms of accessibility, but it's almost as if, what if, think outside the box. Another thing I was struck by was people talking about, there was a sister on one of the calls about the importance of the power of the vote, but how you might have to do vote by mail because of COVID, poll workers, I was one, but a lot of young people stepped up and got to be doing the work that we normally could not do because of COVID, thinking outside of that as well. But just a couple of two quick things just to kind of put this in the mix as we continue this conversation. I was remembering historically Black colleges are here because, you know, there was a segregation. But Clemson University, which is right in South Carolina, an hour from Charlotte, a young Black student named Harvey Gantt, who ended up being the mayor of Charlotte, the largest city in the state of North Carolina, and his wife, who was a student at the time, they ended up going into the president's office at Clemson. And what he shared with him, I think, is indicative of what we have now. He said to them, and he ended up being a senator, I think, from South Carolina. I can't think of the gentleman's name, but, you know, he said, you know what? There are a lot of people on this campus who do not want to have this school integrated. But then he said this, he said, you know what? But I'm not sure there's much we can do about it because not only have we run out of time, we have run out of history. not only have we run out of time, we have run out of history. And look where we are now, and thinking about that and pondering that. And then the question I have, there's two of them, and I like to leave them rhetorically. Mev, you know, we talked about this on previously on our check-in. The notion about how change happens, hearts and minds in public policy. Hearts and minds in public policy. A lot of people might not be interested in electoral politics, but they might be interested in how you change perceptions or how you change people's minds. But until something else comes along, it's the one that I know we have that might be thinking about that. But then the question is this: I'm Black, I'm a lesbian, and if people remember that landmark huge decision of Edie Windsor's, remember Defense of Marriage Act in 2015 when she won that case? But in 1967, you had the Loving versus the state of Virginia case that legalized interracial marriage, Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving. So I had a hard time that day because that same Supreme Court decision all but gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Think about it. And why are we put in situations in which we have to think about, am I a lesbian, am I a Black person, or whatever? And maybe it comes down to this question: are we about justice, or are we about just us? And if you think about that question and where you line up in terms of what that means, are we about justice, or are we about just us? And fortunately, I think we can do both things. And what we continue to see, women, lesbian, bi, whatever it might be, running for public office, getting them, and or running to be the person who's in charge of soil and water and where you live in the county and city. I'm just trying to think of how we move forward in terms of what these questions are and the dynamics and the critical role that OLOC can have to play in that. And I think that's what I've got for now. And thank you.